Welcome to Dropout. Today's topic will be about the legalization of recreational use of marijuana. I have four different people here that have their own varying opinions about marijuana. If you support the recreational use of marijuana, stand to the right. If you don't, stand to the left. Legalization of marijuana will phase out black markets, taking money away from organized crime and street gangs. If you agree, please have a seat. Why do y'all agree?
Because if you're legalizing it, then it's going to be more standardized, so people aren't going to be going behind other people's backs trying to get around the law.
I believe if you legalize it, it like takes away the like economic value of it on the street. So it's like different for the value of things. Like it diminishes it a bit.
Those who disagree can have a seat. Why do y'all believe it won't take away money from drug cartels and street gangs?
Well, I believe it won't take money because if someone has it, if you don't, they can sell it. I guess they have it. It's all about supply and demand.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to take away no money from street gangs and all that because everybody's still going to need it, basically. Like, I don't.
Students who use marijuana will find it hard to study and learn because it hurts the ability to focus and pay attention, normally pertaining to memory loss. If you agree, have a seat.
Like studies have shown that over a period of time, it's usually not a short period of time, usually a long period of time, it does actually take away from your brain cells and it causes memory loss. And students shouldn't be really using it recreationally. It affects everybody differently, but if it's something that's going to make you lose your memory, then it's not good for students to be doing it, in my opinion.
Well, it's a mind-altering drug, so when you're on it, you're not going to be thinking as clearly as you could be when you're not on it. So for that point, if you're trying to study and you smoke before, you're not going to be able to study as great.
I believe that it minimizes your ability to focus because if you smoke 7 days a week, that's taken away from your normal state of mind to be able to study, to remember certain material.
I disagree because some of the smartest people in the world, I believe, smoke marijuana. And I know a lot of people that smoke marijuana and still can get throughout their day and go to class, get A's and B's. So, yeah.
Question 3. Everyone in jail that was previously caught with marijuana when it was illegal stay in prison. If you agree, have a seat. Okay, everybody can have a seat.
It's kind of like a double standard, so if people are going to get away with it now, then the people back then should be released for the actions they've done, even though it was technically illegal back then. Just because they're legalizing it now, I think they should be able to just not be set up.
In my opinion, it like kind of takes away from people like having their life because of a law that was changed. It's like it just makes it not fair for everybody. And like if you're in jail for a crime that's like not really, for lack of better words, like hurting anybody, you shouldn't really be in jail still, especially if that thing is outlawed. So it just doesn't make it fair for everybody.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking the same way as him. I don't see how it's hurting anybody. Like, I didn't see me hurt not one person ever in my life.
Yeah, someone that has a non-violent crime for distributing marijuana shouldn't be arrested and sit prosecuted.
Marijuana is a gateway drug, one that will lead someone to take other drugs, for example, Xanax, Percocets, and lean.
I believe it can be a gateway drug. It's not. I'm not going to say it always is, because there are people that just stick to strictly smoking. But it definitely can, just for the fact that, like I said, it's a mind-altering drug, and if they really like the way it feels, the way it changes their mind, the way it makes them feel internally, they might want something more powerful, like I don't know, cocaine, heroin, something that gets you like really feeling differently compared to just weed.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said pretty much. It does, like, weed to me seems like where everybody kind of starts off. You don't really, not everybody is built to like start off like on cocaine or something like. So weed kind of builds up, and then you build your tolerance to it, and then you don't want to feel that way anymore. So you want to feel something different, something stronger. So people go on and on and on until they find an addiction and it kind of takes them over. But I don't think that's for everybody. Weed could just be something that people stick to, but I believe it is a gateway drug for some people, just depending on your tolerance of things and what you want and what you're going through.
Why do y'all believe it won't lead to taking other drugs?
Well, simple because whatever you have the decision to either do it or not do it. Like weed is its own drug, but like Percocets and Oxycontin, you have the ability to choose whether you want to do that or not, and you're gonna have some type of idea of the consequences of doing it or the effects of doing it. We're talking about highly.
Yeah. I don't think weed is a gateway drug because like it don't affect you as much as the other Percocets and stuff. They strong, like, and you can't even get those without like a medical prescription. Like, yeah.
So do y'all believe that the chances are increased that someone who uses marijuana will likely take more drugs in the future?
I don't believe so.
No, I don't believe that. It's all about the person's preference. Like I said, if they want to do it, they're gonna do it. But if they don't, that's that.
The legalization of marijuana encourages addiction since businesses will start to target heavy marijuana users and will start to be like alcohol and tobacco. Why do y'all agree?
I'd say I agree because just because all the money that is potentially can be made in the marijuana business. I mean, it's billions of dollars that would be sold just to make a profit, and they're definitely going to go for the younger target, just like alcohol and tobacco products do, because that's their future. They need to hook them while they're young, and once they get them hooked, then they're going to be using it for the rest of their life.
Yeah, I believe it is going to be a supply and demand type of thing, and they're going to have all the supply that they need, and they're going to know who to target and why to target them. So, like just like the vaping kind of epidemic that's going on right now, it's just going to be a marijuana epidemic where everybody's targeting younger kids and stuff like that. Whoever is into it, they just want to reel them in and get all their money.
Yeah, I agree with Tyler. Like, there's a lot of money that's going to be made off this, and why not?
Yeah, I guess everybody has the same viewpoint on this. It's just going to keep making more money, just a different source.
All right, y'all can go back to your respective spots for the last question.
Goody, goody.
With recreational use of marijuana being legal, jobs should be able to deny people who have failed drug tests due to marijuana. If you agree, have a seat. With the recreational use of marijuana still legal, jobs should be able to deny people who have failed drug tests because of marijuana. Okay, y'all go have a seat. Why do y'all believe that companies shouldn't be able to deny people that have failed drug tests due to marijuana?
Just because they changed the law for a reason. If the government says it's okay, then I think the stores or whatever business someone's trying to go for to work for should abide by the same rules. And I don't think it would be fair that the government can say you can do something, but then your job turns around and says, oh no, you can't do this because it's got a bad connotation behind it or something.
Yeah, if the law changes, that means everybody has to follow suit. So if you change the law about marijuana, that means drug tests are invalid at that point, because you can't base somebody's job and they're employed, being employed off of something that's legal, especially if they're not coming into the workplace, high or anything like that. But if you drug test them at work and they're under the influence of marijuana, then that, I believe, becomes wrong, because you're trying to do your job and you're high, and that's, even though it's legal, that's not a place. It's a place and time for everything. That's not the place and time. So it's just not. It's not fair.
Yeah, if they make it legal, I believe you should be able to do whatever you want to do outside of work. Just don't come to work high, and you should be good.
I just feel as though that, even being before employed to an employer, that a drug test shouldn't determine whether you can be hired or not. Now, back to what he was saying, if you come to work high, then that's a different story. But if it's legalized, then that shouldn't hold you back from being employed to that employer.
So even though it's legal, do you think jobs have the right to deny them if they do smoke weed?
I don't think they should deny them. I don't think it should be allowed that they're denied, because the laws changed. So if it's legalized, then you shouldn't be punished for doing something that's legal.
I believe if jobs deny them at that point, then it's discrimination. because you're not allowed to deny people on certain things, especially if that thing is legal. Then that's just discrimination of that person and other people that want to apply for the job.
Yeah, I don't believe they should be able to decline people because that's an old law. Like, and they gotta upgrade they
System.
yeah, like the system.
Yeah. Like if a job employer just declines you because of something that's like an old law, but it's legalized, I just think that's nonsense, to be honest. It's legalized, then just let it be.
With recreational marijuana legal, traffic deaths and arrests for DUIs will decrease. Okay, everybody can come sit down. So do any of y'all believe that it will actually increase? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, why do y'all feel that way?
I feel like it would increase just because now that people think it's legal, some people aren't going to think like, wow, it's going to affect me just like drinking and driving. It's not as harsh. I still have a decent amount of my motor skills left, even though I'm still high right now. Why don't I just go take a drive and see what happens? But that's wrong. You definitely are impaired while driving when you're high, and I don't think a lot of people realize that, so they're just going to try to drive high and then they're going to get caught.
Yeah, just because you legalize something doesn't make it right to do. So if somebody's driving under influence of pretty much anything, especially a mind-altering drug, then it's not going to be right for somebody to do that. Just like it's not right if you're drinking and driving or under influence of anything else and driving.
Well, I feel as though if it's legalized, it will bring more attention to higher authority, like that people can be in use of on the road to driving. So that would just bring their radars up on that.
I believe the DUI is going to increase because people drive high all the time, but you can't tell unless you smell it, or if you smell it and
Catch them in the act.
if you catch them in the act of doing it. And I heard they're coming out with like marijuana breathalyzers soon, and they're gonna make people wrong. Yeah.
If you believe that marijuana has led to any deaths from smoking too much or from lung issues, please have a seat. Why do y'all agree?
I agree with this because putting anything into your lungs that besides oxygen is not good for it. Same with vaping. Even though it doesn't have all the chemicals that tobacco products might have, like tar and other things, pesticides, just the fact that you're getting the smoke in your lungs, it still hurts your alveoli that are in your lungs, and it closes them off, so you can't breathe as much, you can't inhale as much, you can't exhale as much. So it leads to breathing problems, which could lead to asthma or anything like that, and you die from it.
I believe, like, with smoking, your lung capacity, as he was saying, is like shortened. So whenever somebody's smoking, it's obviously going to affect them. As far as the death thing, though, whatever you're wrapping it in, especially if it's tobacco products like backwoods or sweetwoods or whatever, that stuff is cancerous. It says it on the warning label, like it's cancerous, and you actually have to take the tobacco out of it in order to smoke. So it's not just not going to affect you in the long run. It's going to affect you eventually somehow, some way, even though if you don't notice it or whatever, it's going to affect you.
Well, to start off by saying, like, there is a disclaimer on every wrap that you would say, but like it's all about how you consume it. Like, there's different ways you can use. You can use rolling papers, which is like tobacco free, and you can use a bong, a bowl, different ways to intake marijuana than just using tobacco paper, tobacco leaves.
Yeah, I disagree completely with that statement because I don't know not one registered death from weed. Like, you can't die from weed overdose. You can die from alcohol overdose. Yeah, alcohol overdose, whatever.
And there's people like, for instance, Snoop Dogg, smoking all his life. He's still cool, still breathing. It's like people on the other side of the planet or other side of the U.S. that smoke every day, all day. It's fine.
If your opinion didn't change after today's talk and remains the same, please walk off the set.
All right, I'm gonna head out.
What made your opinion change after today's talk?
Well, some of the points that these two were making over here on the side, when we were talking about why it was legal, like the way it can affect you, like on the job, and how jobs can defer you from getting that job because it was legalized and you're still smoking. I guess it would be they should be able to should not be able to do that because, well, no, should, because it is their organization that they're dealing with, so they're not really breaking the law. Besides, just they're only saying that you can't do it because maybe health reasons, or because just company policy, and they want people to act a certain way. They want a certain picture. They don't want people to be outcast and people to think badly on their company just because one person, two people are just smoking weed. So I think that was one of the big ones that changed my idea.
Those opinions who have stayed the same can walk back onto the set. My name is Dalen Coleman, and this is Dropout with 4 people's varied opinions about the recreational use of marijuana. You may all stand up and shake hands and walk off the set.
Hello, my name is Dr. Christopher Kavanaugh. I'm with the biology department here at East Stroudsburg University, and I've been invited here to talk briefly about the college brain. And brain, so I brought a little brain model with me. The brain is, as far as we know, it's the most complex object that's ever been observed anywhere. And of course, we suspect there's many more complex things out there in the universe, but as far as what we've observed here on Earth, the brain is the most complex machine that's ever been observed. And it's incredible what it consists of, and it has billions of neurons, about 100 billion neurons. And each neuron talks with the other neurons in the brain. And each neuron has about 1,000 connections to it. So you have 1,000 times 100 million, and so that's 100 billion connections, which is just mind-boggling. There's no computer on Earth that can even come remotely close to all the connections within the brain. And these connections are not fixed over our lifetime. They actually change. And they change in particular when you're learning things. So when you're in college learning new stuff, you've got all sorts of connections changing in the brain. And we call this neuroplasticity. So the brain is kind of this plastic, it's moldable. And these changes occur over our lifetimes. But again, when you learn something new, as you do in college, you're getting these changes taking place. And so I'm going to kind of take the brain off the stand here. I'm going to kind of open it up a little bit. All right. We find that most of the higher level processing of the brain takes place in the outer part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. And we call that the gray matter. And that's where we have a lot of the complex processing taking place in the brain. And these connections are between the neurons, but they're also between the left and right sides of the brain. Now, we normally don't think of having two brains inside our skull, but we actually do. We have two lungs, we have two kidneys. I mean, we're bilaterally symmetrical in many ways. And as it turns out, we actually have two brains. These two brains are called the left and right hemispheres, and they're connected together by way of a bundle of fibers. I'll kind of illustrate that. A bundle of let me put my brain back together here. Kind of falling apart. Okay, all right. All right, so here's the brain again, all right? So we have the two hemispheres of the brain. We have the left hemisphere, the left side of our brain, and the right side. And as you can see, they're connected together here by way of a bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum. This corpus callosum connects the two sides of the brain together. And there's actually procedures where individuals are suffering from what are called grand mal seizures. A seizure is a condition, it's kind of like an electrical storm that starts in one side of the brain, and it can spread to the other side of the brain. And these grand mal seizures are often life-threatening. They result in the individual that's suffering from it going unconscious, and there's violent body movements, and it can be life-threatening. And in the 1940s, they used to go in and actually cut the corpus callosum, that bundle of fibers connecting the two sides of your brain. And that would prevent the grand mal seizures from becoming too serious. They would start in one side, and then it wouldn't spread to the other side. So patients suffering from these seizures wouldn't experience such life-threatening symptoms. But when this happens, it actually results in a person that has like two separate brains that are completely separate from one another. They cannot communicate with one another. And there are some stories, true stories, describing what it's like to suffer from something like this. You'll be like in the supermarket, and you'll be like fighting with yourself as to what to put into the cart. Your hand will reach for something, and the other hand will like try to stop it. So you get some very strange things happening. But these studies, these split brain studies, enabled scientists to discover what the two sides of the brain do. And we discovered that the two sides of the brain have certain specialties. So for example, the left side of your brain is specialized for processing language. So if you're like taking an English class or a math class, anything that's analytical, you get primarily processing taking place in the left side of the brain. Whereas if you're doing something more like creative or visual spatial, like art, if you're taking like an art class, you get a lot of processing primarily taking place in the other hemisphere, the right hemisphere. So when you're learning new things in school, the two sides of the brain are developing differently depending upon the skill that you're developing in a particular class you're taking. There are some interesting differences between left-handers and right-handers, by the way. Left-handers tend to actually have a little bit less verbal and analytical skills in the left hemisphere and a little bit more of it in the right hemisphere, and sometimes it's predominantly in the right hemisphere for left-handers. So there are some differences, but overall, in general, we tend to do most of our analytical, mathematical, verbal processing in the left hemisphere. And so this is that corpus callosum right here. It's a little bundle of tractive fibers. Just a little, there's about 2 million of them that connect the left and the right sides together. So it's actually kind of bizarre that when we like are introspective and we're thinking about what it's like to be a conscious entity, we tend to think of ourselves as a single conscious entity, and yet we are two separate conscious entities communicating very rapidly back and forth with one another. And so this corpus callosum that allows the communication between the two hemispheres creates the illusion that we're a single conscious entity when we're really actually two separate conscious entities. Roger Sperry, who did these split brain experiments back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, eventually won the Nobel Prize. I believe it was in 1981. He won the Nobel Prize for these experiments. All right. Trying to think now what to cover now. Okay. So another interesting thing is studies that have been done with musicians versus non-musicians. So like if you're learning how to play an instrument in college, then they found that you actually start to develop processing in the brain for listening to music in the left side of the brain, the side of the brain that's more analytical, because you tend to learn analytical skills for processing music if you're taking like a music class. So you're learning how to read notes on a page. So this is like reading. This is analytical, verbal. And so you tend to get more processing in the left hemisphere if you start learning music in a more of an academic setting. Whereas if you listen to music and you haven't had any formal academic training, you tend to process music more in the right hemisphere. So this has interesting implications because it means that if you are professionally trained or been trained, say, in college or by taking a class on how to play an instrument, you've learned how to read music on a page, then you're going to be actually processing the sounds that you're listening to when you're listening to a song in a different hemisphere than you would normally if you were not musically trained. So because the two hemispheres of the brain are two separate brains that process information differently, the music is going to sound different if you're listening to it through the left hemisphere, if the left hemisphere is what's processing the sound information versus the right hemisphere. So this helps to explain why people have different tastes in music. Is because often it's because they're processing it differently in different sides of the brain. So you can't say, well, your taste in music is bad. That wouldn't be objective, because it could be that that person is simply using a different part of the brain to process the music. And so it has nothing to do with the music. It has a lot to do with how you're processing the music. So that's sort of an interesting effect. So the connectivity of the brain being so complex is what produces its almost magical qualities. If you think about it, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you were to take your cell phone, say, hop in a time machine, go back to the 1800s, and you show someone your cell phone, they would be convinced that you're like the greatest magician who ever lived, right? I mean, it's such an incredible technology that it appears almost magical to someone who doesn't know that technology, is not familiar with that technology. Well, the technology of the brain is so incredibly advanced that it almost seems magical. And in fact, some of the seemingly magical aspects of the brain are things that we call phenomenological states. The raw experience of seeing green, for example, or blue. How would you explain that experience to someone who's never seen green or blue? To, say, a blind person, It's ineffable. It's beyond description. There's no way to put it into words. And yet the brain is somehow able to produce these raw experiences that are beyond description. And it's just due to the incredible technology of the brain being so unbelievably advanced. So the difference between an adolescent brain and a college level brain, well, there's a very important system of the brain. It's called the limbic system. And this is, you can kind of think of the limbic system as as more of your primitive brain. It's like the part of you that wants to reach onto someone else's plate if you walk into a restaurant, and then the better side of you says, no, don't do that. So it's the side of you, the so-called Freudian id, the part of you that wants to just do what you want to do, and then your higher level conscious aspect then kind of overrides that, and then you don't do it. And so the limbic system is very important for survival. It's very important for actually learning and memory, because our ability to perceive pleasure and pain is actually processed in the limbic system. And the limbic system tends to go under a greater suppression as we get older, because we learn how to suppress that limbic system. So I would say, like, if you're younger, before your college years, there's a tendency to, I guess, for the limbic system to play a larger role than when you get older and you learn to like suppress the things that you really want to do. And as far as like intoxication, if you become intoxicated, you also get this disconnect between the limbic system and the higher cognitive aspects of our brain that can suppress it. And as you all know, if you've been intoxicated at some point, there's a tendency to be disinhibited. You tend to do more what you want to do. To be more social in an environmental setting that ordinarily where you might not want to talk, to kind of open you up. So the limbic system starts to express itself more, and that's one of the effects of intoxication. All right, so how can we improve our learning when in college? One thing that we can do is to appreciate how memories are formed in the brain. Now, this is actually a very hot area of research, and it's still very poorly understood. But some recent research indicates that one of the systems by which memories is formed is the increase in the myelination of axons. What myelin is it's kind of like an electrical insulator. It's kind of like the insulation around a wire. And the axons are like the wires of the brain. And so as you learn, the brain starts to selectively myelinate and demyelinate axons in order to form different kinds of connections in the brain. And so it's been found that if you tend to learn over a longer time period, in other words, if you don't cram before an exam, these changes occur more permanently than if you're trying to cram for an exam. You don't get the proper changes that are developing and taking place in the brain in order to create a permanent change, something that's going to be like a long-term or life-term memory. And so that's a good reason why it's never a good idea to cram the night before an exam. Not a good idea. Also involved with memory is this limbic system, this system I described earlier, this primitive animal side of the brain, but it's also heavily involved in learning and memory as well, and the pleasure centers. We know the pleasure is involved in forming good memory, much in the same way that you've derived experiences by giving, say you're trying to train a dog to do something right, perform a trick. You give a little treat at the end, and the dog is more likely to perform the trick the same way, or to do what you're trying to train that dog correctly the next time. And so we know that there's positive reinforcement involved in storing good memory. And so we know that the limbic system is involved there. Well, another important component of the limbic system is the amygdala, which is responsible for processing emotions. And so one way to form a stronger memory is to have some sort of positive emotional experience associated with it. So in other words, to be in a good, happy setting, be in a good, happy frame of mind can help to store memories a little bit better. But I would say probably the best thing you could do is, again, to take advantage of the fact that you learn better for the long haul if you learn over a slower, gradual time period as opposed to trying to cram things all at once, because the changes that are needed in order to create longer term memories are ones that take place over a longer time period. The progressive myelination of axons, this wrapping of the electrical insulation around axons. And this electrical insulation around the axons are the wires of the brain that connect the brain together, that connect the circuits together. This myelination actually speeds up the rate at which signals get transported from brain cell to brain cell. It's kind of it creates an additional speed, much in the same way that you move more quickly if you're skipping than walking. The electrical signals along a myelinated axon, they skip, they jump, and so they're able to move more quickly down the length of the axon, whereas an unmyelinated axon, it's kind of like walking. The signals travel at a slower rate. So when you get the myelination around the axons, it allows faster communication between the cells in the brain. And it's believed that this control of the speed at which signals can move around in the brain plays a role in memory formation. And so the advantage then, therefore, is to form the slow, progressive myelination that's going to be permanent or long-term along the length of axons, and also to form the synaptic connections, the ways in which neurons connect with one another, to get those connections more permanent. That again happens better if the learning takes place over a progressive time period as opposed to something that's done just before an exam. Stress, well, I would say again that stress is going to stimulate that limbic system. You're going to have the amygdala kicking in, and if you have the limbic system kind of taking over, they can have deleterious effects, negative effects. One classic case is the Phineas Gage case. Is a railroad worker that I believe this was in the late 1800s, 1880s. He had a spike, a railroad spike that blasted through his skull from some explosion that took place on site during railroad construction, and somehow it resulted in a disconnect between his limbic system and his higher cognitive centers, and so he became disinhibited, and so he would be getting into fights frequently, whereas before he was very mild-mannered. So it had a profound impact on his on the expression of his limbic system. So it came out without being inhibited, and that can, that'll have negative social impacts. Clearly, certainly before an exam, you want to be calm. You want to be psychologically collected, and so you want to suppress your amygdala, your emotional side, so you're going to be more like calm and logical. Speaking of logical, one thing that's important in college is being able to think critically, critical thinking. And there's some interesting recent discoveries that indicate that some very important critical thinking skills are located in this part of the brain right here. It's this part in yellow is called the cingulate gyrus. And the front of the brain, so this is the front of the brain here, is called the anterior cingulate gyrus. So this part of the cingulate gyrus that's in the front is called the anterior cingulate gyrus, and it's now understood that the anterior cingulate gyrus plays an important role in critical thinking. They've found, for example, that individuals that have a larger anterior cingulate gyrus do really well at the following the following test. So the test is performed by presenting a patient cards that are laid down in front of the test subject. If it's a red card, the test subject has to hit a red button, and if it's a black card that gets laid down, the test subject has to hit a black button. Now the thing is, the deck is loaded with black cards, so it's mostly black cards. So it's black card after black card that gets laid down, and the test subject has to repeatedly hit the black button every time he or she sees a black card. But occasionally a red card gets laid down, and they find that individuals that have a smaller anterior cingulate gyrus, again right here at the front of the cingulate gyrus, individuals that have a smaller anterior cingulate gyrus tend to make more mistakes. They tend to hit the black button when they see that occasional red card getting laid down. Whereas individuals that have a larger anterior cingulate gyrus tend to make fewer mistakes. When they see that red card coming down, they'll hit the red button. They won't just instinctively hit the black button. And it's believed that this plays an important role in critical thinking, being able to think outside the box. If you're presented with new data, new information, a new argument, being able to think differently as opposed to kind of just coming to the same conclusion each time without being able to switch gears and incorporate the new information into your revised argument. So it helps to explain why developing your anterior cingulate gyrus can play an important role in improving your critical thinking skills. And interestingly, they've studied schizophrenic patients, people with schizophrenia, and they found that they have damage to this anterior cingulate gyrus, which helps to explain in schizophrenia why you have a disconnect with reality, is sort of a loss of critical thinking skills in schizophrenic patients due to actual physical damage in this part of the brain. So as you practice your critical thinking skills, something that we try to do in college and in universities, you're developing your anterior cingulate gyrus. Oh, okay, yeah. There's one very prevalent myth about the brain, and that is we use only 10% of our brain. It's actually not correct. The origin of that myth actually comes from the fact that the brain consists of two basic categories of cells. We have neurons, and then we have what are called glial cells. The glial cells are like helpers. They help out the neurons. And they're called glial cells because glial in Greek means glue. And it was once thought back in the 1970s and prior, it was believed that the glial cells didn't perform any useful function of the brain, that they were kind of like the glue that held the brain together. But we now realize the glial cells actually play a very important and crucial role in brain function. They help the brain out. They help to shuttle nutrients to the brain. They help with the brain's defenses to like destroy bacteria, to gobble up bacteria that might enter the brain. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of glial cells, but there's actually 10 times more glial cells in the brain than we have neurons. And so this is the origin of the myth that we only use 10% of our brain and 90% of it's not being used. So it's actually not correct. You're using mostly all of your brain all the time. There are some times based upon whatever certain activities you might be performing where certain parts of the brain are used more than others, but still you've got the brain being used pretty much all the time. One example of how we might use a part of our brain differently at one moment versus another moment would be, for example, if you're like reading or if you're speaking, we tend to use the left side of the brain more. Specifically areas of the left side of the brain that are responsible for processing verbal information. There's an area of the brain that's called the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area is kind of like right in this area here of the brain, and it's responsible for processing verbal information. So if you get damage to this area of the brain, then you'll often have an inability to understand written or spoken language. And they call that Wernicke's aphasia. So it's a disruption of your ability to process language. It's like if you had like a stroke in this area. So that's one way of like localizing what areas of the brain are performing certain kinds of functions, is by seeing what sorts of abilities are affected when you have a stroke. Another technique is through what's called positron emission tomography. It's an imaging technique where they can determine where the blood flow in the brain is at a given moment based upon whatever it is you're doing at that given moment. So researchers can correlate activity with activity. Say, when I speak of activity, I'm talking about like the activity of speaking or reading or walking or thinking a particular thought with corresponding brain activity. And so we know that we get brain activity everywhere in the brain. It's just sometimes we get added brain activity in certain areas of the brain corresponding to certain kinds of activities that we might be performing, like walking, talking, speaking, and so on. So the bottom line is that we don't just use 10% of our brain. We're using pretty much all of our brain, but we tend to have added emphasis in certain parts of our brain depending upon what it is we're doing at any given moment. So if you're interested in learning more about the brain, the biology department offers an anatomy and physiology class. It's Bio 111, and a good chunk of that course is spent discussing neuroscience, talking about the sorts of things that I've been talking about and how the brain works. And that's Bio 111. My name, again, is Dr. Christopher Cavanaugh, and I'm a professor in the biology department. My office is room 105. The biology department is located in the Moore Biology Hall, M-O-O-R-E, Moore Biology Hall. And I'm pretty much there all the time, except when I'm teaching. I'm even on campus on weekends, so my door is almost always open. So if you have any questions about how the brain works, feel free to drop in, and I'm really happy to chat with you.